bom dia, boa tarde, boa noite para quem nos assiste a qualquer tempo, a qualquer hora. Sejam bem-vindos ao Profformação. Temos a honra e a alegria de ter mais um convidado aqui que vai nos prestigiar com as reflexões e os apontamentos que tanto nos interessam em linguística aplicada, né? Profformação, para quem não sabe, é um canal criado por mim, Kátia Martins, professora, pesquisadora na área de linguística há mais de 20 e tantos anos, e esse canal foi criado para estabelecer essa ponte entre tantos outros colegas que possam iluminar as nossas ideias e reflexões sobre a língua, sobre o ensino da língua, sobre aspectos teóricos, epistêmicos, especialmente nesse momento sociopolítico, que a gente também conversa um pouco mais sobre aspectos tangentes à nossa vida, né? Tangentes às escolas, às crianças, às famílias, que são aspectos políticos do nosso papel de professor. E eu convido aqui hoje o meu grande colega parceiro nessa empreitada. Colóquio é um projeto meu e do Kleber e da Paula, que hoje não está aqui, mas a quem a gente saúda. Kleber Aparecida é um colega da Universidade de Brasília, com quem eu tenho a alegria de trabalhar por muitos anos, e juntos nós criamos esse colóquio. Então, seja muito bem-vindo, você que não nos conhece, que nunca nos assistiu, e muito obrigada por você nos assistir de novo, se você estiver nos acompanhando. Temos um colóquio a cada mês, com um tema sobre o qual nós convidamos você aí para participar e para interagir conosco. Seja bem-vindo, Kleber, a mais uma sexta-feira de boas ideias.
Muito obrigado, Kátia, pela gentil apresentação. Queria externar minha gratidão pela parceria que nós já estamos desenvolvendo já há alguns anos. Hoje a gente já está chegando ao 21º colóquio juntos e vamos ter a honra hoje de contar com a presença e a participação da professora Claire Kramsch da Universidade de Berkeley, que é uma professora que dispensa qualquer apresentação, uma professora que realmente contribui e continuará contribuindo para o nosso crescimento acadêmico profissional na área da linguística aplicada. Então, eu queria, em nome do nosso grupo de pesquisa, o grupo de estudos críticos e avançados em linguagem, saudar todos os colegas que estão nos acompanhando via YouTube. Eu tenho certeza que vai ser uma manhã muito proveitosa, de muito diálogos e de intercâmbios acadêmicos entre nós aqui. Então, sejam todos muito bem-vindos. E é um prazer estar contigo, Kátia.
Muito obrigada. E eu queria só reforçar que nós estamos transmitindo pelo YouTube, então sinta-se à vontade de enviar comentários, perguntas, nós iremos compartilhar, colocá-lo também nesse diálogo, ok? E aí eu convido para vir aqui a nossa mesa, Neuda, querida colega, quem irá mediar essa conversa de hoje. Neuda irá receber, né, a nossa convidada. Essa é a nossa dinâmica. Eu e o Kleber saímos de cena e Neuda toca o barco, né? Seja muito bem-vinda, Neuda. Obrigada mais uma vez pela sua parceria, pela sua presença aqui no nosso colóquio e pelo seu carisma, né? Esse sorriso brilha a nossa sexta-feira. Muito obrigada.
Seja bem-vinda, Neuda. É um prazer tê-la como parceira e como amiga do nosso grupo de pesquisa. Seja bem-vinda, Neuda.
Kátia, querida, Kleber, meu bem, obrigada a vocês dois. Muito bom dia, greetings, everyone, bom dia a todas, todos, todes que estão nos ouvindo aqui no Brasil, na América do Sul. Boa tarde, boa noite para quem nos assiste em outras partes do mundo. É uma honra participar desse colóquio, né, nessa manhã de sexta, em que vamos conversar sobre os desafios decoloniais na educação linguística. E antes de continuarmos, eu gostaria de convidar vocês a acessar os QR Codes que estão aparecendo aqui na tela, para que vocês possam conhecer um pouco mais do trabalho.
Ok, só um minuto, Neuda, eu vou sair de cena e vou colocar o seu slide, que ainda a gente não está vendo.
QR Codes, por favor.
Ótima manhã para você.
Vocês, beijos. Vamos colocar aqui os QR Codes. Eu já vou aproveitando e convidando vocês para nos seguirem e seguir o canal Profformacao, nosso canal do GECAL. Pode colocar o próximo, por favor, Simone. Então, vejam aqui os que com o acesso via QR Codes, vocês podem conhecer um pouco mais do trabalho que nós temos realizado, e nós temos feito o colóquio todos os meses, enfocando temas como educação linguística crítica, formação de professores, letramento, políticas linguísticas, internacionalização, descolonização, né? Como o de hoje, só para mencionarmos alguns. Então, usem os QR Codes, nos sigam, deixem seu like, acompanhem as nossas atividades e hoje participem da nossa conversa aí no chat. Eu convido vocês a colocarem as instituições, as cidades onde vocês estão. Vamos participar, podem cumprimentar, podem nos cumprimentar aí no chat. Depois eu vou passar uma revista geral e ler para a professora, a nossa convidada, a professora Claire Kramsch, e fiquem à vontade para participar conosco, ok? Então, good morning, everyone. I'm very happy to salute you all. Today's speaker is one of the most prominent scholars in applied linguistics worldwide. She is an emeritus professor at the University of California, Berkeley. Professor Claire Kramsch is born of a French father and a Jewish English mother. And she studied German language and literature in the 50s at the University of Paris-Sorbonne. And after that, she immigrated to the United States and embraced the field of applied linguistics. She taught German language and literature first at M.I.T. and then applied linguistics at Cornell University. And at the University of California in Berkeley, she's been since 1990 until 2006. She was the founding director of the famous Berkeley Language Center. And she's now retired from the German department, but she holds an appointment as a professor at the graduate school there. She has been here to Brazil twice. So the first time was in September 2013, when she gave a keynote at Abralim, our Brazilian Association of Applied Linguistics Conference in Rio de Janeiro. And the second time was in July 2017, when she was president of ILA, and she presided over the ILA 2017, also in Rio. These were two memorable visits and some of her best trips in Latin America. And her work has profoundly influenced language teaching and research around the world. And her multilingual and multicultural background has shaped her research and many publications, and among which I've chosen some here to show. First, these 3 books I'm displaying here, they are bestsellers here in Brazil, our favorites. I told Professor Claire Kramsch that the first one here on the left, Language and Culture, that was my first contact with her writings. And I have some colleagues here from the Federal University of Goiás who studied this book with me in our first year as master degree students at UFG. Also, Context and Culture in Language Teaching. The 3 books are published by Oxford University Press, and the multilingual subject is the most recent by Oxford. Yeah, it is. It was published in 2009. Yeah, it talks about what language learners say about their experience and why it matters. And the last 3 books that I'm showing to you are books that were edited or co-edited by Professor Kramsch. And so you can see here, you may move, Simone, to the next slide. Yeah, thank you. It's too small, isn't it? But we have précis do plurilinguisme e do pluriculturalism, and language acquisition and language socialization, and redefining the boundaries of language study. These are some of the books she co-edited or edited. She has published these books and many others, and a vast array of other publications, including e-books, other electronic publications, many articles in refereed journals, chapters in books, conference proceedings. It's really a vast array. And our GECAL group has had the privilege of taking a glance at a publication that is still in press by Professor Kramsch, and it's co-edited with two Latin American colleagues, Harold Castaneda Peña and Paula Gamboa, and it's entitled Exploring the Decolonial Challenge, Critical Pedagogy and Epistemological Translation in Applied Linguistic Research in Latin America. So we are looking forward to reading the book when it's published, and we are already advertising it to you too, so that you can get it when it's warm coming from the oven. And as it's our tradition in all our GECAL colloquia, I will offer you some information on Claire, the person behind the famous scholar. Now, I know you are all curious about and very interested in knowing a little more about her. So just some snapshot on Claire's life. Here, I put for you some of the most prominent people who have influenced her. So on the left, you have French sociologist Pierre Bourdieu. And then on the right and below, you have linguists, applied linguists, who, when she moved to the United States at age 30, they influenced her a lot. They are Henry Widdowson and Chris Candley. Yeah. Widdowson is very much known here in Brazil as well, Claire. We've read a lot his writings, and I believe mostly about the non-native or native speakerism. His studies on that have been really spread out here. Okay, and among the clothes, I asked Claire, and this is something she loves wearing, blue jeans. Yeah, she wears them all the time. And as for food, the next, please, Simone. This is something Claire really loves eating, and it's something she prepares. She herself prepares. It's the French tarte aux pommes, the apple pie that she prepares. She makes out of the green apples from her apple tree in her garden in Berkeley. I'm talking about that. You can see here. Next, please, Simone. You can see here her garden, her patio. Yeah, that is her favorite part in her house. I believe, Claire, if I lived there, it's very likely would also be my favorite spot, because it's lovely indeed. And moving on, here you can take a look at some part of Claire's family. Here you have a son, a daughter-in-law, and 3 grandsons. These are some grandsons that who live in LA, and they call her grandma. Yeah, they speak in English, and she also has a grandson who lives in Germany, and he has a very special nickname for Claire that she loves very much. He calls her Pouille Rousse. Yeah. In French, it's something very caring and tender when you call someone ma poule, yeah. He calls her Pouille Rousse. That would be something like little red hen, yeah. And it comes from the story La Petite Pouille Rousse that she used to tell him in French, occasionally translated to German when he was a child, yeah. And she calls him in turn Mein kleiner Fuchs. Forgive me my German. I told Claire I'm terrible at German, but because she speaks German to her grandson in Germany. And talking about telling stories, you may move to the next slide, Simone, and we can see here some of the people Claire most spends her time. It's with the visiting scholars at University of California, Berkeley. So you may zoom to the pictures. Simone, you may zoom to all of them at once. So presently, she has been with some visiting scholars from actually, they are an Estonian scholar, a Chinese scholar, and her young daughter, and a Ukrainian scholar and her family too. And so they cook, they eat together at her house. They go egg hunting in the garden at Easter. And she's a great storyteller. Yeah, since she had her grandchildren. So she tells the children stories that she used to tell her own grandchildren in French, in English, and in German. So people, can you picture yourselves being a visiting scholar at UC Berkeley, yeah, receiving you and your family such a heartwarming welcome from none less than Claire Kramsch. Yeah, so you can imagine how lucky and blessed these fellows are. Yeah, so yeah, I've had the pleasure of showing a bit for you of this marvelous person and of this visionary scholar, a trailblazer in our field, a true catalyst for change, our esteemed speaker for this colloquium, yeah? And to whom we are sincerely grateful. So accepting our invitation is a cause for our gratitude, because we are going to have this privilege of listening to her, and you may interact with her through the chat. I invite you to write your comments in the chat. I'll read later to her. And so without further ado, I invite you to join me in giving a warm welcome to Professor Claire Kramsch.
Thank you so much, Neruda. This was an absolutely wonderful introduction. Thank you for collating all these pictures. And thank you to Simone and Kleber and Katja for inviting me to contribute to this lovely topic and this lovely gathering. So I will ask, I guess it's Simone who's going to show my PowerPoint. And thank you so much for listening. And I look forward to the discussion after my 30 minutes are over. Yes, I will be talking about the decolonial challenge in foreign language education. As you know, I don't teach English. I have taught German and occasionally French. French is my native language. But I took German at the end of, or during and at the end of World War II, and have been specialized in German language and literature since then. But as Neruda said, I moved to the United States in the 1960s and have been then involved in German and applied linguistics since then. So let me show you the outline first of my talk. Can we have the next slide? Yes, I'll talk roughly what the problem is. Then I'll talk about very briefly about what has been written in foreign language education regarding decolonization, which everybody's talking about today. I will be talking about discontinuities in the way we convey and transmit and teach knowledge. The word epistemological refers to knowledge and its creation, its construction, and its transmission through language. And even though we are not psychology teachers, we do teach language in order to affect and to have an impact on the cognitive world of our students. And I want to talk a little bit about that. Then I'll talk about the project that Neuda mentioned, this decolonizing applied linguistics research in Latin America. And I will end with general remarks on how we should conceive as language teachers of decolonization in foreign language education. So could I have the next slide? Thank you. So foreign language education, we've got to realize that whether we're teaching English or German or French, any European language, any Asian language, any language at all, generally has to do with political and colonial power. Whether our foreign language education system is a centralized system like you have in Brazil, you have a nationwide educational system, or a decentralized educational system like in the United States. The goals of foreign language education have generally been to have an impact on the knowledge by our students of the rest of the world in order to establish better trade relations, better foreign relations, to prevent world wars by speaking each other's languages and knowing each other better. Today, of course, and not only in the United States, we notice a lower interest in learning languages other than English, because English has become dominant. It is the global language of the planet, which has raised all kinds of concerns about the identity and the legitimacy of people who speak other languages, like, for instance, in my case, French and German. And they have raised the concerns about the coloniality of foreign language education. Some people like Suresh Kanagaraja talk about the imperialism of English. And particularly in Latin America, there have been a lot of concern about the imperialism of English and English speakers. So let me have the next slide. Thank you. Before we talk about colonialism, we've got to talk about the different meaning of the word colonialism. Carmen Guerrero, in the book that is going to come out with Cambridge University Press, with Routledge, makes the difference between colonialism and coloniality. Coloniality, in the work of Adriano Cuyano or Castro Gomez, means a permanent process of material and symbolic exploitation, and even the propagation of such ideologies as racism, sexism, and discrimination against people who are different. So coloniality is a much broader concept than colonialism, which is a historical actual domination of one country by an external colonial power. Neuda asked me why I was interested in decolonizing education. That's because I grew up in a family where my French family was very involved in French colonialism. Many of my uncles and aunts went to the French colonies like Indochina, North Africa, Ivory Coast, Madagascar. They married women from those countries, and they were in favor of that kind of colonial empire that the French had, which made them pretty arrogant. My mother, however, who was British, belonged to the British colonial empire and looked down on the French, although France was not exactly a colony of the Brits. Britain and France always had a rivalry in their colonial empires. So the word coloniality is broader and applies to colonial power, even when it is not applied to with an army and a navy. There are two words that need to be distinguished, is decolonization and descolonization. And that is a distinction that Mary Pratt makes. She claims that descolonization is a political process of historical change against capitalism and neoliberalism in all its forms. So there again, like coloniality, descolonization is a political concept, much broader than, or in a different way, broader than decolonization, that is in the English-speaking literature an unspecified movement against inequities of race and gender and for greater social justice. Let's pass on to the next slide. So here are two quotes, one from Mary Pratt and one from Carmen Guerrero. So from Mary Pratt, she says, and I will read the highlighted in red, "It is not possible to overlook the gendered and racial dimensions of the confrontation between the two colonial powers, the English and the Spanish, nor the potentially colonizing relation of English to Spanish." Mary Pratt is professor of Latin American studies at New York, NYU, New York University, and points out the colonizing power of English around the world. And Carmen Guerrero, who comes from Colombia, refers then descolonization to the political state of colonization and efforts to decolonize in Latin America and Colombia in particular, when she writes, it is urgent to understand the pervasiveness of Latin American language policies that still insist in classifying their members as first or second class citizens based on their ethnicity, color of skin, geographical location, and many other aspects considered non-compliant with the capitalist white male Christian world system. That could apply in many respects also to the United States. Let's pass on to the next slide. In foreign language education research, the word colonization, coloniality, has meant indeed a relation of dominance, but not between two countries, but in different ways. Domination by majority language speakers towards minority language speakers. That obtains and is relevant both in any Latin American country, but also in the United States. the English speakers versus Spanish speakers, English speakers versus indigenous Indian American languages, etc. Also, the domination of native speakers or speakers of the standard variety, of non-native domination by those native speakers, of non-native speakers or speakers of non-standard varieties. As you can see, it is the colonization of the elite, the educated native speakers who come out of Harvard, Yale, etc., vis-a-vis the less educated or less standard language speakers. It is also the domination and denigration by heterosexual white speakers of non-binary, gendered, or non-white speakers. And it's also the domination and stigmatization of monolingual speakers vis-a-vis bi or multilingual speakers. That I have particularly suffered from the monolingualism of the French society when I grew up in France in the 50s, but it applies also to the United States, where English only is applied in many foreign language policies in schools and in curricula. Can we pass to the next slide, please? So here in the next 3 or 4 slides, I just want to show you what has been published. I won't go in all those citations. There are 3 areas where research on decolonization has made itself felt. One is against linguistic inequalities and social injustices. These are publications by Holmes and others in Britain and in Denmark, as the last title that you have there on this slide show. I will have on my PowerPoint a whole bibliography, so that you can then consult at a later date. Let's pass on to the next slide. The next batch of research in applied linguistics on decolonization focuses on the unequal relation of power between speakers of foreign languages, particularly English, based on their linguistic, gender, racial, and ethnic identity. There is a book that I can particularly recommend, is the Donaldo Macedo, Decolonizing Foreign Language Education, the Misteaching of English and Other Colonial Languages. But there are also special issues of applied linguistics and of critical inquiry in language studies that would be worth consulting if you're interested in the topic. Next slide, please. And then there's a third group of publications that focus on critical decolonial voices from both the South and the North in the journal Language, Culture, and Society, in particular in the 3 issues of that journal. And I will be drawing particularly on the third one, Language, Epistemology, and the Politics of Knowledge Production, since I will argue that we need to decolonize not only the language itself, but the cognitive structures and the ideology behind the words that are associated with a certain form of knowledge that I will discuss presently. Can you have the next slide, please? And that's when I come to those epistemological discontinuities. When we teach a language, we teach a way of thinking together with that language that has a history. And decolonizing the teaching of foreign languages means making visible patterns of thinking that are behind that particular language. this is a point that Walter Mignolo and Catherine Walsh note, that Western modernity has always had colonial ambitions, and it will become clearer in the next slide, namely the belief that the modernist way of viewing the world is the only acceptable one. And that has to do with a modernist turn of mind or attitude towards knowledge that you will recognize presently. Next slide, please. Some tenets of modernism is the belief in linear technological and scientific progress. That's why in your textbooks, for instance, you go from chapter 1 to chapter 15 or from chapter 1 to chapter 30, and there is supposed to be a progress from chapter to chapter. And at the end of every chapter or at the end of every section, you are supposed to be able to measure the progress of your students in time and in the space of the textbook. The presentation of the grammar in your textbook has a kind of Cartesian rationality. You first teach the present and then you teach the present perfect, to show how the present perfect builds on the forms of the present. All this has a utilitarian view. You teach language for the students to be able to use the language. You teach them usable skills. That is all part of a utilitarian mindset that foreign language education operates under. What foreign language education also operates under is in a literate tradition. Even though you are teaching oral skills or communicative skills, you are teaching them that by a blackboard, by a textbook that uses written language. You write down. It is a literate tradition for teaching an oral language. That is how Western modernist education operates. You teach them standard English. You don't teach them a variety of accents that you can only find in pockets of regional ways of talking. All this, teaching them standard English, measurable English, literate English, is a way of building a monolingual nation that speaks English. Or if you teach them French, it will be standard French, Parisian French. It will not be the French of immigrants who come to France, or Breton or Alsatian. And a modernist view of viewing foreign language education also thinks in terms of binary items, such as male versus female, white versus non-white, native versus non-native. These are the binaries typical of a modernist perspective. Next slide, please. By contrast, there is another way of viewing education, which is a non-linear, associative way of thinking and speaking, not progressive. We know that our students understand things in the beginning stages of language learning that cannot be neatly slotted in the progression of the textbook. There are things that you want to teach them at the beginning that are not in the textbook. For instance, I will, when I teach them, where do you come from? Which is the question that we often teach in beginning language classes, they have a choice of saying, I come from Paris, or I come from Versailles. If I am asked, where do you come from? In France, I will generally say I come from Paris, because Versailles has a rather doubtful or politically unwished for connotation. If I am abroad and I want to show off, I will say I am from Versailles. And people will say, oh, yes, I've been to Versailles. I've seen the castle. Depending on what you want your interlocutor to have associations with, you will answer one or the other. So you have a choice. You have, depending on the context, you have a choice of speaking or not speaking, of remaining silent. You have the choice of using metaphors and which ones. There is an oral tradition. What you learn orally is not the same as what through storytelling, for instance, is not the same as what you learn through printed language. And a post-structuralist or postmodernist view views knowledge as much more ecological and holistic than the traditional literate-based, textbook-based forms of teaching the language. Next slide, please. So I've got 3 examples, and I'll take only 2 because of the time. Examples of a discontinuity between forms of knowledge that are modernist and forms of knowledge that are postmodernist. An example of a postmodernist view of the term interculturalidad versus interculturality is reflected in these 2 words. Boaventura de Sousa Santos, the Portuguese philosopher that has had a great deal of influence in Latin America, considers, and who writes his book, Epistemologies of the South, writes in English in this book. The other books are written in Portuguese, but in this book, 2014, he writes, intercultural translation is the alternative both to the abstract universalism that grounds Western-centric, speak modernist, general theories, and the idea of incommensurability between cultures. In other words, what Santos is saying, that in a postmodernist view of foreign language education, we accept that one word is not the equivalent of another. Interculturalidad can be the translation of interculturality, but it has a really different meaning. It consists, in fact, interculturalidad accepts that cultures are incommensurable, so that there is no universal knowledge that applies to everybody. Brazilians, through Portuguese, have a different view of interculturality than English speakers, and the 2 words are associated with different worldviews, different forms of knowledge. Interculturalidad is much more interested in fighting against capitalism, colonialism, and patriarchy, and for social justice, human decency, and human dignity. So it is, and Santos adds, it is important to reinvent social emancipation and insurgent political imagination. By the way, that phrase, that sentence is an echo and an answer to Paulo Freire's attempts in the 70s to invent social emancipation and insurgent political imagination by including interculturality in the mix. Let me pass on to the next slide. By contrast with Boaventura de Sousa Santos, Michael Barham talks about interculturality. And Michael Barham, who comes from education, who is a Brit, who comes from sciences of education, takes a much more evolutionary view rather than the revolutionary view of Santos. He writes, culture is knowledge, and he writes in 2021, page 94. Culture is knowledge, but it is knowledge which is shared and negotiated between people, belonging to all of them, and not being idiosyncratic to any single one. That sentence for me means that by saying that knowledge can be shared and negotiated, puts the focus on the negotiation, not the incommensurability between cultures. In other words, interculturality means that we, in Barham's view, that we are tolerant to other people's forms of knowledge or worldviews, but that we can negotiate between us. Santos does not speak of negotiation, but emphasizes the differentials of power, of knowledge, of legitimation. So they put, both of those scholars put the accent on different aspects of the intercultural conflict between peoples. Barham adds that this definition is not an all-purpose definition, but a definition to suit the purposes of the foreign language teachers. Following Santos, I will argue that the foreign language teacher is, by definition, a political social actor and has to stress the political and intercultural difference, the colonial difference, by making visible the differences of colonial power between, say, English and Spanish or Portuguese. Let's pass on to the next slide. Two words that are also in a different, express different worldviews is the term relationality. English has a way of saying that things are relational to one another, but vincularidad, which is the term used by Cusicanqui, Sibone Cusicanqui, Silvia Cusicanqui, who is a Quechua speaker and who speaks Spanish, uses the term vincularidad. And I will read the what Walsh and Mignolo write about vincularidad in red. Relationality doesn't mean simply to include other practices and concepts into our own. Its meaning references what some Andean indigenous thinkers, including Nina Pacari, Fernando Guanacuni, Mamani, and Feliz Patsipaco, refer to as vincularidad. Vincularidad is the awareness of the integral relation and interdependence amongst all living organisms, in which humans are only a part with territory or land and the cosmos. As such, vincularidad, relationality, unsettles the singular authoritativeness and universal character typically assumed and portrayed in academic thought. Relationality, vincularidad, seeks connections and correlations. But the Spanish word is much more political, much more encompassing than just the Cartesian relationality expressed in English. Let's look up. The term vincularidad is in fact the Spanish translation of a Quechua term, sumac cose, that expresses the relationality of the human and the natural world, the trees and the plants and the flowers, that is central to indigenous thinking. So if we think of indigenous knowledge, it is different from the modernist universal kind of rational knowledge that is taught generally through foreign languages in foreign language education. I will pass to the next slide. Okay, I think I will skip that and pass to the next slide. Yes. You have here in this slide the contrast between Michael Barham's view of intercultural citizenship and Pennycook's view of translingual activism. Michael Barham vigorously rejects Pennycook's view of anarchic resistance and revolution. Pennycook, the Australian scholar, argues for a translingual activism aimed at decolonizing both public spaces and languages. He suggests moving beyond the rally, the union, or the ballot box to explore new modes of politics and engaging in new modes of resistance focused on more anarchic traditions of social media connected occupation. In other words, Pennycook is for, and we will see that later, relativizing English and making it only one of many different languages, and supporting the renewal of the translation studies in foreign language education. Barham, in fact, vigorously rejects Pennycook's view and defines his position as in favor what he called reformist internationalism rather than revolutionary internationalism. He wrote to me in a personal email. So let's go on to the next few slides. Okay, let's pass on to the slide for the case of, let's pass on to the next slide. Okay, people in decolonization studies talk about the global north and the global south, which does not necessarily refer to a geographical location, but to an epistemological, a cognitive dimension, a way of thinking. And I have highlighted in red how, for instance, Anna Defina and her co-authors write, the idea of the South has been deterritorialized and has become a metaphor that draws attention to disparities resulting from past colonization and present globalization dynamics that traverse the economic, cultural, political, linguistic, and epistemic spheres. In other words, you can live in the North and have a Northern mentality that is basically a modernist mentality, or you can live in the North and have a Southern mentality, which is more politically acute, more post-modern, post-structuralist, and takes the whole political and philosophical context in consideration. So we have to think of expressions like global north and global south more in philosophical or world views that are independent of where you actually geographically spend your life. So let's pass on to the next slide. This is a comment on the term translanguaging, which you have probably heard. Translanguaging has been criticized recently. Translanguaging meant passing from one language to the other, sometimes without transition, the way bilingual people do that, mainly between English and other languages. And some people have criticized the term translanguaging as a form of recolonizing all other languages by English as a global language. It's the indispensable language of Google Translate. And some people wonder whether it's a recolonization by English or it is the epistemological principle of all intercultural translation. But there are some voices in the decolonization movement that put into question the validity of using languaging that always favors English yet again. So let's pass on to the next slide. And I want to talk about one particular feature of the book that you have listed here on this slide, that is Castañeda, Gamboa, and Kramsch, which is an edited volume, and where we asked every author in that volume to start their chapter by stating explicitly and making visible their locus of enunciation. And we asked them to do that in 2 languages. What is the locus of enunciation? It answers the question, qui parle? Who is speaking? Who is writing? Not necessarily your biography, as Neuda very kindly did with me at the beginning of my talk. Not so much my own biography, but where do I position myself as a writer in the language that I choose to write in? And so we asked them to make visible that locus of enunciation in English and in another language, which can be their mother tongue, and then reflect on the difference between the two. I'm going to give you 2 examples taken from the book. Next slide, please. So the first author, that is, in fact, as you will see, Carmen Guerrero from Bogota, she writes first in Spanish and then in English. I will not read the Spanish because my Spanish is basically nil, although I understand what she wrote. I will let you read the English, particularly the 2 sentences that I have highlighted in red. Then I'm going to read the English. And in English, she says, I graduated as a PhD from the university. I recall that during the commencement ceremony, there was a display of the flags of the countries the graduates came from. I saw the flag of my country and I felt very emotional because I would have never dreamed of that moment. I thought of the privileges I had enjoyed thanks to the access to public education. Next slide, please. Right, we asked the authors then to reflect on the 2 versions of their autobiography. So she writes, in my autobiography written in Spanish, I locate myself geopolitically in Colombia, a colonized country that for too long has embraced Western values and that has ignored other knowledges otherwise. In that Westernized context, I made career choices based on the pragmatism set out by a capitalist world that shapes life based on the market demands. That career path took me to embrace forms of knowledge dictated by the global North. In the autobiography written in English, I locate myself as a woman who has graduated as a PhD from an American university, amazed at the odds of achieving such milestone, me, a child of a low-income family who lived in a small town in Colombia. Next slide, please. Now, I comment on her reflection on her locus of her 2 loci of enunciation. The very enunciation of this autobiographical note is a decolonization practice in intercultural translation. And that comes from a very good article by Figueiredo and Fernandez. The author had to decide, Carmen Guerrero had to decide what to say about el yo que habla aquí and me in English. What needed to be said and what could remain implied. For instance, in Spanish, the fact that she was an English and Spanish teacher, a maestra de inglés y de español. And in English, the fact that she has a PhD from an American university. Now, she says one in English and the other in Spanish, but two different foci, she attracts the attention of the reader in two different ways. And she had to decide what was best silenced in each language. For instance, in English, she does not mention her political activism. And in Spanish, she does not mention her academic research. So we have to ask ourselves which concepts were translatable and which were not. For instance, in her Spanish presentation, she talks about Foucault's mecanismos de selección that she learned about in Spanish, not her English language teacher training. What assumptions we should make in each language about her readers' state of knowledge. So what she wrote has to be seen in the larger dialogic context of her speaking, writing to two different audiences, an English-speaking audience or a Spanish-speaking audience or readership that has different associations with what does it mean to write that she has a PhD from an American university. And the pride that is associated with that doesn't come across in Spanish at all. Okay, next slide, please. She then had to reflect on the distribution between the said and the unsaid, the different ways in which she would structure, sequence, and prioritize her professional and her personal information in each language. And ultimately, she would have to decide which enunciative identity she would choose to display in relation with the other language. It needs to be said that while the 10 authors were fluent in English, 8 of them were native speakers of Spanish or Portuguese. 2 of them had Japanese or Jewish Russian ancestry, respectively. Those 2 ancestral languages, Japanese and Russian, remained silent witnesses in their locus of enunciation. So in order to show where you position yourself, you always have to also consider what did you choose not to say or to remain silent about. Next slide, please. So the difficulties, the authors in the book had difficulties doing the exercise, and their difficulty were of 3 kinds. Some authors were unaware of the different indexicalities or the semantic associations of various concepts in Spanish, Portuguese, and English. They had a structural knowledge of the language, but they didn't always understand the cognitive associations of the words in English. For instance, what does it mean to say you have a PhD from an American university? What does that evoke? Where does that position you power-wise in the world? Some authors refused vigorously to think differently in different languages and to occupy a different locus of enunciation. Some authors said, English is my second language. I am no different in Spanish and in English. But of course, they are read differently in Spanish and in English, while they do acknowledge that some concepts were untranslatable. Some authors had difficulty in positioning themselves into national, gendered, racial, or ethnic categories. They prefer to hold on to carefully constructed, professionally neutral, or universally valid locus of enunciation. Some were Afro-Colombians and did not want to say that they were, in fact, of African descent. They just spoke of themselves as Colombians. Next slide, please. The next slide, I think I'm going to skip because it is because my time I can see is up. So I will ask you for the next slide. This author used the word "cuiqui" that I can't really pronounce, that is translated by the Spanish colonizers as corazon. Well, then you've got to show the previous slide. I'm sorry. Can you go back to the previous slide? Yes, thank you so much. This author expresses himself as a mestizo who comes from a Latin American country but lives and works now in Ireland, where he teaches English and does ethnographic work in the Andes. So here is his way of presenting himself in Spanish, and when he writes in English, he mentions that he is grounded in his personal and professional work in Senti Pensante and El Buen Vivir, within a proposed framework for teaching and research that is centered at the heart of humanity. But the word heart, corazon and cuiqui, do not correspond with one another, which the next slide is going to show. Next slide, please. Yeah, the concept of cuiqui, which he uses, was translated by the Spanish colonizers as corazon. En Muisca se piensa con el corazón. But this author plays with the word corazón to include con razón. There is a whole interesting dilemma on how to translate cuiqui, first in Spanish and in English, without being infected by the associations of the word heart. Thinking with the heart is not exactly the same as in Spanish, se piensa con corazón, especially if you play with the word corazón as con razón. And the author in this book plays with the different translations from the Quechua to the Spanish to show that we should use translation in language classes, but always show the untranslatabilities, the incommensurabilities of the different languages. Next slide, and I think I'll conclude here. What might a decolonized foreign language education look like? Well, you have to, one would have to, through foreign language education, convey to the students the different languages express different world views, epistemologies, namely ways of knowing and viewing, acquiring and conveying different knowledges. Recapture translation, but not in order to find exact equivalences, but to explore the untranslatabilities between languages. Be acutely aware of the different worlds and positionings that are indexed by the use of different languages. Okay, and the final slide, I think. Yes, I would like to finish on a quote by Alistair Pennycook and his notion of an anarchic epistemological activism that he has been advocating recently in the Macedo book of 2019, where he says we cannot, at least at this historical juncture, turn our back on English, but we can seek to provincialize it, to place it where it belongs, to decolonize its words. We need a translingual activism that seeks to connect resources to political action aimed at decolonizing both public spaces such as schools and languages such as English by putting them constantly in relation, in vincularidad, towards one another, and show that English is never separate from indigenous languages, other colonial languages, and all kinds of various ways of making meaning in language as a semiotic assemblage. Pennycook right now is publishing with Cambridge University Press a new book called Language Assemblages, in which he's going to develop that decolonization philosophy of his. I want to thank you for your attention. I think the next slide is called for. Thank you, and I welcome your comments. Sorry to have gone a little overboard in time.
No, you didn't. It's just perfect timing. I wish we were in a presential ambience so that we could clap to you. Professor Kramsch, we are deeply grateful for your lecture. Yeah, thank you for illuminating our virtual stage with your wisdom, your knowledge. Yeah, your lecture was truly exceptional, and your ideas they are as diverse as they are impressive. Yeah, and as I asked you, and you mentioned in your words that I asked you about your path into decolonization. Yeah, you are, and everybody here watching us knows, you are a thought leader. Yeah, so from your groundbreaking research that has always redefined what we call our conventional knowledge in applied linguistics, until these pioneering solutions that you have presented in this talk today, and we can see this that they encompass society's most pressing challenges, and you have consistently demonstrated this dedication to pushing boundaries. And so on behalf of the audience and of myself, thank you very much for this wonderful lecture. And just before we move on, I'd like to call our audience that is watching us now online. I'd like to engage you and invite you, if you have some comments. Yeah, let's make this presentation truly interactive. Yeah, drop your thoughts here on the YouTube chat. Yeah, your opinion matters a lot, so don't hesitate to join our conversation. You may ask your questions, you may share your takeaways in the comment. We are all here to learn together. Yeah, so if you are curious about anything here from the lecture, you may ask. You may engage with the comment, yeah? Leaving your comments and questions there. Professor Kramsch, we will be delighted to see your Brazilian perspective for the Brazilians who are watching us, or from other nationalities as well. You are all welcome. So while you are writing your comments or questions, we are going to start discussing some questions previously elaborated by our GECAL group. Yeah, just know that we are waiting for your comments. And Professor Kramsch, we have people here. I was just taking a look on YouTube. We have people from different parts, all parts of Brazil. From the north, we have from Pará, from Amazonas, yeah, where the Amazon jungle is, and from the extreme south, yeah, Rio Grande do Sul, Curitiba, the Universidade de São João del Rei. We have people here from the Central West region where I am and where Universidade de Brasília is. People from Jataí, Palmas, so Serra Talhada, Jussara, Bahia, yeah, from many federal universities, yeah, many IFs, Institutos Federais, Campus Óbidos. Ricardo, você está com a gente de lá. So many professors, students, doctorate students, master's students. So I was taking a look at all of them sending their greetings to you and thanking you for your wonderful lecture. And some of them, while you were discussing, presenting the differences in the concepts according to the languages, some of them were guessing and say in advance. For instance, Evandro said interculturality and interculturalidade. I believe they also have distinct meanings. That was before you said. So they were trying to guess while you were presenting some. Yeah. So they were really engaged with your talk. And thank you very much to all that you are attending our lecture, and they are all saying that it's a pleasure to be here with us. Thanks a lot. Okay, so Simone, darling, if you could, please, you may give us, yeah, we have Ricardo right here, such a pleasure to be here. Thank you for writing that. We are going to start talking some topics, and you feel free to drop your thoughts on the chat space on YouTube while we are beginning with our questions here, okay? So Simone, maybe the next slide may call for, let's see. Yeah. So actually, I've already asked, I had already asked this question to you, Professor Kramsch, and you have contemplated it into your talk. I would just add something. I'll read the question, but before you say something, I'll add something at the end. Okay? So the question was, many of us in Brazil are well acquainted with your contributions to the intersection of culture and language education. Could you kindly share further insights into the pivotal experiences that guided you toward the journey of decolonizing education? And as you said in your lecture, you can live in the North with a Northern mentality, yeah, or you can live in the North with a Southern mentality, yeah, with a post-modernist view, a decolonial, a critical view. And that's exactly what you've shown to us today, yeah? A Northern inhabitant with a critical, a decolonial, a Southern mentality. And we are thrilled, delighted to see this in you. And so if you want to make any comment on that any further, because you've already made, so feel free.
No, thank you. Yes, you're right. You're right. It has to do also with the North and the South. Of course, originally, because I am French originally, my incentive to put into question the colonial, the French colonial empire, or not so much the empire, but the arrogance that goes with a colonial empire did not come from a southern, for me, did not come from the global south. It came from the confrontation between my mother and my father, between the British colonial empire and the French colonial empire, and the arrogance of each of the parents they thought their empire was superior to the other. And so it was that contradiction that led me to escape the contradiction, because I thought that after World War II, in the 50s, when I got married to a German, I felt that the Germans were much less arrogant than the French and the British, because after the war, they were totally destroyed. They were totally kaput. And so they were nicely humble and modest, and they were open to other questions. Now, it was my destiny that I married a German who wanted to emigrate to the United States. But I thought that the United States was much less arrogant than the British and the French. So I arrived and I thought that the United States is an open country. Everybody's an immigrant. Everybody has to start by zero and work himself up. And so I thought that it had no inequalities. Of course, I did not think that they had killed all the American Indians and they had enslaved generations of African slaves in the South. Nobody talked about that. And nobody talked about the anti-Semitism in the United States. So I was very disappointed with the United States. The United States is as arrogant as other colonial empires, and it thinks it owns the world. It is the policeman of the world. So I was disappointed with that, and I tried to understand the nature of my disappointment, and the literature on decolonization has helped me a great deal.
I'll be quite honest with you, Professor Kramsch. I feel so privileged for experiencing this very moment, listening to this background of yours. And I believe my audience feels the goosebumps the same. Yeah, that is something quite amazing, the experience you've been through. And especially for us, because it's something rare. We've been, as you did in the new book, and I can't stress enough how eager we are to have this new book published. As in the new book, you stressed the North has published some research concerning this decolonial view or some critical studies, but it's basically different of our view here as Southerners. So when we have the opportunity of interact with someone like you, and as you've just explained to us, coming from this background that provided to you such an open-mindedness, I think that was something providential, let's say. And I believe the world is much better because you are in it. No doubts about it at all. Thank you for enlightening us about that. Let's move on to the next. We have Simone. I'm going to ask you, please, to put one, skip days, please, and give me one from the YouTube. That is, skip this one, this political question. I got one there from YouTube. That is, you've just put here for us. Professor Kramsch can read here.
Yes, how can the concept of border, that is Fabiana da Silva that sends me that, how can the concept of border, frontier be rethought in multimodal context?
Yeah.
That is a very interesting question. I think that there's too much, I would use the word propaganda, because it is a marketing ploy, a neoliberal strategy to make people believe that there are no more borders, that English has taken over the planet, that we are all human beings, that nations or national governments play less and less of a role, and that we're in fact all consumers of capitalistic goods, and we are all equal vis-a-vis money and the market. But in fact, we interpret the market very differently. We interpret the life and death very differently. And I am all for rethinking borders, not as limits between two powerful national governmental entities that created World War II, World War I and World War II, but the borders of the mind, that we should accept the colonial difference, as Mignolo would say. We accept that we think differently, we interpret differently, depending on our position and our locus of enunciation and our history. So I like the second question. How can the concept of border be rethought in multimodal context? I am particularly concerned right now with those invisible algorithms that manipulate our emotions and our thoughts from underneath the social media and the Google Translate and all the electronic modes of communication, without us knowing how these algorithms have been set up and channel our thinking without us knowing it. So I am all for making borders visible and reflecting on those borders.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Professor Kramsch. We have another one here by Gelson Bueno. Gelson is from Goiânia. He says, I would like to first congratulate Professor Kramsch for the enlightening lecture. My question is, how can we, as teachers, improve the working with the colonial perspective in our schools? Gelson teaches elementary school, so elementary and high school.
Yes, my question would be to Gelson, would be less at what level of schooling are you talking about than what are you teaching them? If you are teaching them language, are you teaching them the structures of language, the morphology of language, or do you teach them how to understand language as a semiotic system, as a way of making meaning through linguistic structures, but also through images, multimodal, through gestures, through food, through clothing? And do you teach them how to decode, how to decipher the meanings of words, and how to understand that the meaning has to do with which word have you chosen, to whom do you say it, after what anticipating what? Teaching them the perspective of the speaker, of the writer, teaching them the metaphors that they use. When, for instance, you talk about immigrant, I mean, I'm talking now about the media, but when you read in the press about the immigrants pouring into the country, flooding the borders, waves of immigrants from South America coming to the border in the United States, you are already using words that are negative, that indicate a threat, and that needs to be annihilated or prevented, building a wall to prevent the waves from coming into the United States. So that would be an effort in decolonization.
So many inspiring ideas. Yeah, Gelson. Wonderful. When you were talking about your experience, Professor Kramsch, Ricardo Almeida said, wow, what a testimony. All the Americans should be here listening to you, Professor. Okay. And here we have another comment, and another question. Before this question by Carlos Eduardo Lopes, he wrote a comment. The idea of the non-linearity in the language education process is quite interesting. Back in the day, I would always question myself about the organization of textbooks. Yes. And then the question, please, Simone. Yes. The question now. Talking about textbooks, how do you see their role in a decolonial practice?
Okay. The decolonial practice does not advocate against textbooks. Textbooks are needed to structure the semester, to structure the teaching, to structure the timetable, and to structure the knowledge that the students have. But they are not, how could I say, textbooks do not grow on trees. They are not natural products. They are the product of a publisher that needs to make money. They are the product of an author that has a particular political perspective. This is why right now in Florida, Governor DeSantis in Florida is putting a clamp down on the kind of readings that are allowed in textbooks, because he does not want Florida school children to know about slavery and to know about women abortion. So the question is, obviously, textbooks are the result of a choice by the market and by the author of what is acceptable knowledge and what is not. So you can use any textbook that you want, provided that you, what Pennycook called, provincialize it, meaning you historicize it. You show the students, we are going to use this textbook, but I want you to know what the textbook does not contain and why it does not contain it. So you show the biases behind the textbook. It doesn't mean to say you can't use the textbook, but you lift the veil behind the textbook.
It's just a matter of problematizing the issues, yeah, Claire,
and making them visible.
Indeed.
So that you can talk about them.
Yeah, and I think we as teachers, yeah, professors who form teachers. We must deal with that, because when our students, for instance, at universities, when we form teachers and they go to schools here in Brazil, the schools usually have a textbook and the teachers can't get rid of that. They are supposed to follow the rules, and they are supposed to cover certain units. So they must be prepared to work with those units, whichever content is there. Yeah, so it's really what you've said. It's a matter of making things visible, problematizing.
Yeah. When I was teaching, I would used to tell my students, I'm going to teach you this ABC, and it's going to be in the textbook chapter 1, 2, and 3, because I am paid to use that textbook, and I am paid by my university to teach you what you're going to find on the exam. But if you come to coffee with me after class, I will tell you what you really need to know.
What a wonderful solution. Lovely. All right. So, guys, I know you are all very excited to ask questions, but we are running out of time. Yeah. So some comments here, Professor Kramsch, we've got here. Perfect. Thank you very much. The colonial mind. That's wonderful. Okay. We had some other questions that we had planned, but they were just in case questions, and I think we can finish just with maybe one more. That will be the last one. Simone, do you have? Let's have a coffee then, Fabiana. Yes. That's wonderful. Yeah. I'll just have, I'll finish with one slide. I don't know if Simone has been able to manage it. Simone, it's the second, not really this one. Oh no, baby. So you may just skip this one, please, Simone. The next one, please. Yeah, that's our last. It's just this one, not to leave a decolonial talk without just mentioning Paulo Freire. Yeah. So let's just talk about this to finish. In your view, how does Paulo Freire's advocacy for libertarian education intersect with the principles and themes of decolonial studies, Professor Kramsch?
Of course, Paulo Freire has a lot to do. I mean, he was the pioneer in what we would call, in American English at least, emancipatory education. He wanted to emancipate the oppressed masses, the illiterate masses, by teaching them the literacy that would be necessary for taking action, political action, social action towards a revolution on the national scale. Of course, Paulo Freire, who wrote in the 70s, did not think of the global English, the globalization of the planet. He did not think of the multilingual composition of our classes, and he did not think of what would be needed to bridge the gap between the need for national unity and for a global market, because we are training students to become good citizens, but not only good citizens of Brazil, but good citizens of the planet. And so that's what it is creating, this difficulty for language teachers who are supposed to teach skills or capacities or cognitive and linguistic capacities that are difficult to imagine on the global scale, which is why Paulo Freire, who used a critical literacy. Criticality is, of course, still relevant today, and we need to teach critical discourse analysis or critical discourse awareness. But criticality is no longer just the Marxist view of a national revolution, although there's a lot of inequality in all of the countries. But we have to go first to the ballot box, and you in Brazil, you seem to have done the right choice by voting in Lula da Silva as your president. You have already intersected what the government can do and what the individual could do. Now it's a question of implementing in the curriculum what Dilma Rousseff and Lula da Silva have already given you or are giving you on the governmental level.
Excellent. All right. Thank you. Simone, you may take the, thank you very much, dear. Professor Kramsch, just some words from the audience. Love it. Fantastic. Such a pleasure to listen to you. Thank you, Professor. Thank you so much for this morning, Carlos Eduardo said. Thank you. Gratitude. Perfect. Many words from the audience here. I'm delighted. I was delighted to listen to you. So we came to the end of our colloquium, and I'd like to thank again Professor Claire Kramsch for being here with us. Your expertise has shone through. Your dedication to educating has inspired us very much. Thank you for gracing us with your presence.
Yes.
Your perspective is truly unique, Professor Kramsch.
I think we're all on the same wavelength. Yeah.
You see, the impact of your words, believe me, they will linger far away, long after this event.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And I'm inviting now, I'd like to thank our audience to thank you for being here with us. And you who are watching us offline, many days, months, and years after this colloquium, thank you for your attention too. And I'm inviting now Professor Kátia Martins and Professor Kleber Aparecido da Silva to conclude our event.
Thank you. Thank you, all of you. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Kramsch.
And all good wishes.
It was a good pleasure being here. Yes. Thank you so much.
Okay. Shall I log off, right?
Yeah. Thank you. Ok, muito obrigada, Neuda. Professora Kramsch nos deixou. E aqui em público fazemos um agradecimento a ela, afinal de contas, o fuso horário é muito grande, a professora esteve conosco aqui nessa diferença de horário. Muito obrigada, Neuda, pela sua amazing interaction with a professor. Acho que a sua interação, ela faz dessa manhã uma manhã mais prazerosa ainda. Obrigada, Kleber.
Foi maravilhoso, viu, Neuda? Foi maravilhoso a sua mediação. Eu acho que as colocações que a professora Kramsch, né, Kátia, fez são colocações muito assertivas, né? Porque acho que uma coisa é a gente pensar epistemologicamente o que é ser decolonial. Eu acho que outra coisa é você ter uma mentalidade decolonial e ver a sua mentalidade decolonial sendo refletida numa praxis decolonial, né? Então, eu acho que
né? Esse é uma grande mensagem, um grande recado que ela nos deixa nessa manhã de reflexão, é que não se trata de uma teoria, se trata de uma posição, né? Uma posição filosófica, ideológica, uma posição de sujeito na sociedade. Exatamente. Como você se vê, eu achei muito emocionante ouvir os exemplos, né, de como somos, como a nossa identidade nos define em diferentes línguas, e como isso é importante para nós, professores de língua, percebermos isso, né? Que a identidade dos nossos alunos são as identidades dentro de uma classe, são constituídas de maneira diferenciada, são expressas de maneira diferenciada. Isso acho que foi um grande conforto, uma grande alegria para nós. A Simone está nos lembrando aqui, nosso próximo colóquio dia 22, com a Adriana Moncada, Lina Carrilho, duas grandes amigas aqui do coração, que com certeza vão abrilhantar essa manhã. Estarei eu e a professora Paula Cobucci mediando essa conversa, e será uma alegria muito grande ter você de volta, que nos acompanhou. Convite outros colegas, repasse essa ideia, divulgue o nosso trabalho. A gente faz isso com muita paixão. Kleber?
Então, mais uma vez, queria, né, Neuda, agradecer muito a sua mediação. Eu acho que foi uma manhã muito prazerosa, né? Acho que vai dar para a gente os slides da professora Claire Kramsch com várias referências, né, para a gente até aprofundar a nossa concepção e compreensão do que é um sul global, do que é uma mente decolonial, e convidar você que está nos acompanhando agora, acho que vários colegas de várias partes do Brasil estão aqui presentes nos acompanhando, que nos dê o privilégio, né, de ter você juntamente conosco no próximo mês, onde as duas colegas, amigas nossas da Colômbia, irão fazer uma fala bem interessante, trazendo um pouco, né, Kátia, essa perspectiva, né, Neuda, que como grupo de pesquisa a gente tem trabalhado, que é uma perspectiva decolonial. Então, eu queria agradecer muitíssimo essa oportunidade de estar com vocês essa manhã tão especial. Muito obrigado.
Um beijo e até a próxima.
Um beijo, gente.